Okay, HARLAN Ellison A format paperback collection overview. My God. We're going to need a coffee. We're going to need a brioche. We're going to need to take a deep breath. HARLAN Ellison, legend. To those who know him, a legend. As I say, it's that simple. To those who don't, it's who is this guy? And HARLAN, has a big reputation. There's an awful lot said about him. He was a big character. A lot of people didn't like him. A lot of people loved him. We're really just going to talk about the A format paperbacks today and my own personal sort of history of collecting and reading Ellison, really. This is what this is about. So I decided just to focus on the A formats, and some I've moved on over the years. This is what's lasted. Am I a completist? I'm not a HARLAN Ellison completist. I'm almost a completist. For example, the one book you won't see today, which is one of the holy grails of vintage paperback collecting, is Sex Gang, as by Paul Merchant, which goes for up to £600. Do I really care? Yeah, I'd like one. Am I ever going to shell that out for a paperback? I can't see it really, I can't see me being able to afford it or justify it. And it's also his sort of juvie stories, which I've got plenty of. And, Ellison, like Silverberg and Barry Marsberg later on, they wrote in all sorts of areas to become working writers and not to have other jobs, so they could then move on to the work they really wanted to do. And in this sort of mid to late 50s, Ellison and Silverberg they didn't share a flat, they were in the same sort of apartment building, and I think Bob was upstairs from HARLAN or the other way around, and they sort of like did a lot of sort of work, not together, but they encouraged each other and talked and what have you. And theoretically, the story All the Lies That Are My Life, this at least is what Silverberg says, is partially based maybe on their relationship and the way their careers panned out. So that's interesting. It's a good story, actually, really good. It's about 100 pages long, so it's really a novella. But we're going to look today at the A formats, and I'm just going to talk to you about my personal journey with HARLAN and how I've enjoyed the work and how I discovered it. And I was introduced to HARLAN by my friend Philip Owen, who's a great line artist, comics artist, animator, and he really sort of I think he showed me his copy of the illustrated Ellison. It may have been The Beast of Shout, Love, the Heart of the World, and this would have been around about 1980, and that's how I got into his work, which is great. So I'm going to begin with Ellison's first novel, Web of the City, aka Rumble, and I don't have a copy of the book as Rumble. I am picking one up soon off Dorset Bob, so I could have waited and shown you some more. He's got some pyramid editions and earlier editions for me, which I'm sort of getting as just because they're there and because I love HARLAN. And this is the Ace edition. Actually, these are all from Ace. These are all from early 80s. Let me just check the date. You can see Moorcock behind HARLAN Ellison there, simply because that's where the shelving is. But of course, Mike and HARLAN were chums, because in either sides of the Atlantic, they both fostered the new wave. So yeah, so Rumble published 1958, and 1976 the copyright was renewed, and this is the first Ace edition from February 83. So I was 20 when I got that. Okay, so there we are, and I've read this 3 or 4 times. I haven't read it for a while. It's a great little novel. It's good fun. What is it like? It's about New York street gangs in the late 50s when they had switchblades and zip guns, which is a gun you can build yourself. And, they're sort of kids from different ethnic backgrounds in different parts of the city that were run down. And it's something Ellison experienced himself, because he went and ran with a street gang. They were younger than him, but because he was short, he was a diminutive guy, he could get away with pretending to be young, and he had to go through their initiation ceremony and everything, and he got involved in a rumble, a street fight. So it's really interesting. So yeah, so it's rather like, if you've ever seen West Side Story, or if you haven't, and you should watch the original film version from the late 50s, which is wonderful, wonderful film. And I'm not much on musicals, but it's great. And I saw as a kid, it had a big impact. And this was a big problem. Juvenile delinquency was a big problem in the inner cities of America, particularly in New York in those times. And as it is still in all throughout the world in big cities, you know, where people are disenfranchised and what have you. And yeah, so it's that sort of narrative, and really, really good, really good. I really recommend it. It's a great fun read. However, the first Ellison Ace book that I got was a gift, a birthday gift from my really good friend Gary Cartwright, who's going to appear on the channel, and we're going to talk about Philip K. Dick from an interesting angle at some point. And this is Spider Kiss, aka Rockabilly, I think was the title of the original version. And I've had this since, let's have a look at the date. And Gary bought this for me. This is July 82. Gary bought that for me in 82 for my, let's see, so he would have bought it actually in 83 for my 20th birthday if it wasn't published till it, because my birthday's in May. So he got me that for my 20th birthday, which is great. And I'd read a fair whack of Ellison then. I'd read loads of the short stories. I had quite a few of his books under my belt, and they were hard to get at that point because his deal in the UK with Pan had ended, because he'd been rather troublesome with them and they'd sort of dropped him really. And this straight ahead novel about an Elvis type character and how he's treated in the music industry, and you know, the ups and downs. Some of the early rock and rollers, you know, they were bad boys, you know, they had issues with underage girls and that sort of thing. We think of Jerry Lee Lewis, what have you. We think of Elvis, Elvis type character, how he's exploited by a Colonel Tom type figure. And it's great fun, you know, it's good. Rock and roll novels are funny things. They're usually terrible because it's difficult to capture the authentic feel of what it's like to be in a rock and roll band, what rock culture is like. And I always come across a bit naff, but this one's not bad actually. And I'm going to talk on that theme at great length at some point, because rock and roll novels, there ain't many good ones. So yeah, so I've still got that. And Gary bought that for me from a marvellous shop called Forever People in Bristol, which was on Park Street in Bristol. Park Street's still there. And through the sort of 80s and 90s, it was a wonderful place if you wanted to buy books and records. There were lots of bookshops, record shops, and there's still a little bit of that lingering now. There's the last bookshop is still there. I think that's about it. And I worked on that street in the 90s, and I was selling books there. And lunchtime, you'd nip out and you'd go to the other shops. You'd get discounts off the record dealers, who were really cool, and it was just a great sort of milieu. And sadly it's sort of gone. It's nearly all eateries and bars now. They did have those things there then, but you know, the sort of cultural side of it is on the way out. And Forever People was there. It was there for about 15 to 20 years, and I went down to Forever People at that point. It would have been after, I think, Gary gave me this, so I would have been about 20. Maybe I was younger, I can't recall. My first two visits are confused in my head. I went once with my friend John to get stuff, and once on my own. And I remember going in there, and the shop was quite small then. It moved to a bigger site later on, and there was a sea of paperbacks of people I'd never heard of, mostly American imports, and it was just amazing. And I talked to the guy in there for some time, but that's Spider Kiss. Interestingly, if you want to copy this, I'll show you the back. Now, it does need a clean there. Now this, let's have a look. The spine's not too bad actually. That's pretty good, isn't it? Andy Richards, Cold Tonnage Books. He has got 2 copies of this on sale, and one of them is a variant cover. The back is different. It's a different picture of HARLAN. It's in a different place, and I have thought of picking it up just for fun, but you know, we don't want to go there. So if you want a copy of Spider Kiss, or 2 copies in the variants, it's a nice little sort of associational collectible. He's got them on sale for a decent price, so there you go. And HARLAN looking very cool there. And he was kind of at the height of his fame. He's good 10 years past his initial tranche of Hugos and Nebulas. But, you know, he's really famous, and he's on talk shows all the time and things. He's a real sort of key figure. But he is starting to fall out with people in the industry and not help himself. So, other early Ellisons in Ace from that period. Memoirs from Purgatory. Now, Memoirs from Purgatory, I'm going to flip it here, is kind of a companion book to Web of the City. Now, fundamentally, you've got the fictional take and the non-fiction take, and this tells you all about a moment when Ellison, he ended up being arrested for possession of a firearm, or he didn't have a license, and he ended up in the Tombs, or he wasn't actually in the Tombs, that's where people hang themselves. He went wrong and hung himself in the Tombs, as William Burroughs said. He ended up in prison cell, waiting overnight, waiting sort of to be sort of got out by his attorney. And what actually happened was that he was jammed up in a cell with one of the characters who inspired Web of the City, one of the people he rang with in a street gang. They hadn't seen each other for years and years and years. And Ellison had sort of gone under a pseudonym when he was in this street gang and wrote the novel based on that research. And this was about that encounter and Ellison's ire about the way that people from the underclass who ended up in these situations, largely no fault of their own. And this is great. Now, there is a Alfred Hitchcock suspense, you know, that little series they're repeating on BBC. It's not BBC, it's on the TV. It's on one of the TV channels. They're showing one every night. Alfred Hitchcock Presents, I think it's called. There is a version of Memoirs from Purgatory in that series. I think it only dramatises the second part. It doesn't matter. It's got James Caan in it, and I'd love to see that. James Caan, fantastic at portraying these very sort of physical yet inarticulate characters, which is why he's so good in something like Rollerball. You know, brilliant stuff. You know, and it's excellent. So I'd love to see that. But it's probably been, and I've missed it. So you know, it is what it is. But I'll try and track it down properly one day. But yeah, that's great. So those are kind of a pair, really. Really good. And you get Ellison's polemical writing, and of course he used to say, I'm not a science fiction writer. Now we know that what made him famous more than anything, even though he started working in TV and film script writing early on, was his award-winning and staggeringly good Fierce SF, which we will come on to. But really, he was an all-rounder, you know, and that's why he was the most decorated writer in the history of writing, more awards than anybody, because a lot of them for mass media writing, for TV and film. And he did a lot of that in the early 60s, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, all kinds of things. And he really, really did well with that. It was a big thing for him. And he, of course, did all these juvenile delinquent things, which we're looking at now. And here's a great little collection. This one, I didn't get at that time. I got this much later. The other ones in this, I pretty much bought them all when they were issued. I got this a long time after. This is The Deadly Streets. This is more beat up, as you see, because this had an owner before me, and they didn't give it as much love as I tend to give my books. And it's got, see, some of the spine is ripped off there, which is a shame. And this, you know, various age marks. I can't think when I got it, but it may have been 20 years ago, maybe 10, 15, but it's a long time after the other. And this is kind of, again, juvenile delinquent stories. There are other things out there like the Paul Merchant book. There's also Children of the Streets, I think it is. I've got a 7-house hardcover of that, which is super rare as well. So these are JD stories. So they're partially exploitation. But as I say, Ellison really, he didn't want to work that way. You know, he did care passionately about things. And, you know, he had a good social conscience. So Memoirs from Purgatory, so they're a kind of trilogy in a way in those Ace editions. So that's one part of Ellison's early work, which is really important. And it's worth mentioning cyberpunk here because, of course, Ellison, he understood the street king mentality. He was bullied when he was young. He's from Ohio. He was small. He didn't fit in. And, you know, and he had considerable sort of ferocity and nerve, and he would always fight back, even physically if necessary. And he's very much from that Hemingway school of write about what you know, and go out and do things, which is really important, and not an ivory tower guy at all. So there we are. So we'll take a look at some actual 60s books now. This, as you can see, is a Belmont double, rather like an Ace double. Except it's not a DOS chapbook. You don't flip it over and something on the other side is presented straight ahead. That's the correct term, by the way. People say Tate Baish, you know, head toe, but it's DOS chapbook. You can see that in the Science Fiction Encyclopedia. That's what you call an Ace double that flips over. And that's Doomsman, which Ellison hates, or hated. If you present him with a copy of this, just sign, he would tear it up. And Telepower by Lee Hoffman, who's a lady author who was a friend of his, and she has a story in, I think it's in Again Dangerous Visions. She's not in the first one, she's in the other one. And I have read this a long time ago. I had a much cruddier copy, which I sold on within the last year. So I picked, because I really want to get rid of it, because I got this edition, which I think is nicer. Got that from Morris at Zardoz, All You Need Is Books. And Once I'd sold on my old copy of this, I found I missed it. And I'm not really generally very sentimental about sort of books in this era, as I say, but it'd been in the collection for a long time. So I picked up a nicer one. I think I got that from Dorset Bob. And this isn't that uncommon, actually. You know, green text block. It is what it is. It's a very, very minor book. I mean, there are some minor early novels from this period. Sound of a Scythe is one of them. And, you know, Ellison wasn't really a novelist. He didn't write many novels. And that's probably why he's not as famous in the SF community today as he should be. Because he writes short stories. And, you know, of course, a lot of people say, oh, I don't like short stories. But, you know, that's a real test of a writer. And his short stories are just fantastic. They just are. You just need to get some, go to bed early, open up the book, take your time, immerse yourself. Don't expect all that sort of, oh, I want to get sucked into sympathetic characters nonsense. Just read the man's prose, okay? Sharp, humane, heartfelt, angry, blissful, superb. Absolutely superb. So yeah, so this is another edition. This has got Lynn Carter, Thief of Thoth, and again, green text block. And this is Belmont as well, I think. Let's have a look. Yeah, this is Belmont Tower, and I think this is a later one. This is July 72, so this is a 70s book. That's a 60s one. So let's just have a look at the date on this. Let's see. This is August 67, that one. So there you go. And I'd say minor work, really. Then you've got, I used to have a load of these sort of early collections and these sort of 60s liveries, and this is Belmont Tower as well. I bet this is actually an early 70s one. This is From the Land of Fear, which is a great story. Let's just have a look. Let's see. 74 edition. It's very 60s looking, isn't it? You know, great stuff. And there's some lovely stuff in this. We'll just have a quick shifty of it. And of course, throughout the 60s and 70s, Ellison won loads and loads and loads of, you know, awards, Hugo's, Nebulas, what have you, all kinds of things. And it doesn't have a contents page, so I'm not going to bother with that, quite frankly. So yeah, so these are still out there. They're getting more sort of big money. I have had various ones myself that I've moved on, because often Ellison's one of those people who got accused of, you know, taking his best stories and popping them into other collections and what have you. And he said, well, it's all about, with a collection, trying to have it thematically unified. And, you know, there's a certain, you know, that is a good aesthetic point. And he did do that a lot. So I forgive him for that. But, you know, you end up with multiples of the same thing. And, you know, and space is an issue. So I have moved some on. But as I say, I am acquiring some early ones again from Dorset Bob. The thing with Ellison these days is that, you know, there are certain stories that people obsess over, and the one that people seem to be familiar with now is I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. When I, you know, Boy and His Dog really is, if there was one, that would be the one. But we'll talk about that in a moment. So here's some more Ace ones, which again, I think they all come from the early. This is Pain, God and Other Delusions. This was a book which first appeared, I think, in the 60s. This is, again, we'll take a look at the date. I imagine these are all from the same time. This is, again, 83. So this was the last major paperback reissue program that Ellison actually ever had. You know, there's print on demand things, there's trade paperbacks as other books come forward. But in terms of getting the backlist back out there, Ace were the last people to go with him. And, you know, it's a very long time ago. You know, let's say 83, you know, it's 40 years ago. It's, you know, it's ancient history. So it's a shame. And it's because he was so awkward. You know, we saw this with Keith Roberts, and it happened with HARLAN as well, you know. And even though he was a really good self-promoter, you can't sustain that, you know, when so many people in the industry turn against you. You know, your legend can be as big as you like, but it ain't going to carry you all the way through, you know. And he did divide people. I've spoken to dealers who met him who really didn't like him. I never met him. I wish I had. I'm not sure if I'd have liked him as a person, but I do love his writing. You know, there's Christopher Priest said that he feels that Ellison, his reputation stood on a handful of sensationalist short stories. And I think that's true to a degree. You know, they are sensational, but it is the very stuff of SF when it's at its best, and he's doing his SF. So this is Pain, God, Other Delusions. Pain, God's a great story, and that pops up again in the collection Deathbird Stories, A Pantheon of Modern Gods, which is one of the first books I read by Ellison in the Pan edition. And just looking at this, and yeah, it's dedicated to Robert Silverberg, So there you go. And it's got some great stuff in it. Oh, wow, great stuff. Repent, Harlequin said, the TikTok man, Sleeping Dogs, Bright Eyes, The Discarded, and Deeper Than the Darkness. I mean, these are really, really good seminal, pure genre SF stories, which are very sharp and pointed and focused and poetic, full of anti-heroes. So they feed into cyberpunk, they feed into new wave. Ellison's attitude, more than anything else, is really important in those things. And you know, I can't say enough good about them. They're really great stories. They've got sort of typical themes, but they're managed with real sort of verve and attack, and there's no fat on them at all. No fat on them, and they're just great. So that's paying God. And I have no mouth and I'm a scream. Again, as I say, this is the one people talk about these days. There's lots of audiobook versions of it online and on YouTube. And again, this is August 83, so they're all from the same tranche, and I picked up most of these the same time, and that's HARLAN there in the cover. And of course the title story is about a future when an AI has pretty much taken over the earth, killed everybody off apart from a handful of people who it has underground, and it tortures them for its own amusement. And it, you know, it doesn't pull any punches, and the people in the story are struggling to survive, and they're not painted as heroes, they're painted as the deeply flawed human beings they are, and it's just great writing. So there we go. And on the back there's a thing about some film company was stopped in an attempt to make a movie called I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, and they were told it's Ellison's title, even though you can't by law copyright a title. And you know, this is the kind of hyperbole you get saying, oh, you know, they wouldn't do it. You know, you could do something called Moby Dick if you wanted and not worry about it, but you can't do that one. So there you go, building the legend. What does it have inside? Again, 83, and these are all sort of first thuses really. There's an introduction by Theodore Sturgeon. There's the titular story. Eyes of Dust is a good one. Lonely Ache, Delusion for a Dragon Slayer, Pretty Maggie Money Eyes. These are just fantastic stories, really good. And these are the best way to get into them. A short, brief collection which has, you know, 6 or 8 of these gems in it, and you know, let it seep into you slowly and take your time and enjoy them, and just wonderful, wonderful stuff. You know, as I say, Ellison really cared. You know, he was fierce, and sometimes he could be hateful in person, and you know, he didn't like stupidity, he didn't like sort of dumbness, and you know, he was a self-mythologizer. He did build up his legend, and I can understand why people didn't like that. But you know, they are really good short stories. They're really powerful, and you know, and you really relate to them, and they're things you should very much read when you're young. And I love reading them now I'm old, but you know, you read them when you're young and they really catch fire for you. They're really intense, fantastic stuff. Okay, this one, Love Ain't Nothing But Sex Misspelled, is a lot of stories about love and sex, as you would expect. And I don't think I got this at the same time. Now, it's got a little bit of rippling and the spine is quite faded. There's HARLAN looking handsome on the back. He was a big hit with the ladies, apparently. And let's see. I don't think I got this at the same time as the others. It's 83 again. I may be wrong, but the wear on this one is much greater than on the others, and that indicates to me that I didn't buy it alongside those, and I don't think I did. I must have got this later on. So there we are. And you know, this is a big thick one for him, and this, let's see, 68, and then I think it's actually expanded in this edition. There's a lot in it. It's a big book. Yeah, okay. And a lot of these are not in other collections. Some of them are not SF. Riding the Dark Train Out, that's a good story, about a young couple who've jumped a train and there's a tramp on board with them, and it's, you know, the resurgence of Miss Ankle Strap Wedgie, that's a good one as well. So some of those I haven't read for a long time, so I must sort of go back to that one. So there's mainstream stories as well in that, so that's a great one to pick up. Those are primarily SF and fantasy stories, so there you go. Ellison described himself as a fantasy writer, especially later on. He said, I'm not a science fiction writer, I'm a fantasy writer. But of course he was made famous, as I say, by his string of Hugo and Nebula awards for short fiction, you know, which are just impeccable, and he deserved every one. They're fantastic stuff, you know, they really are great, incisive writing. The opposite of the bloated crud we get most of the time today in SF. The argument is this guy couldn't write a long novel. He didn't need to, you know, he just wrote brilliant prose that got under your skin, underneath your nails, and pulled your guts out. This is the kind of writing that we need more of. Just good writing that cuts to the core of things, says a lot, is heartfelt, and is sometimes outrageous. You know, it's a good thing. So HARLAN, go back to HARLAN. The late 70s, early 80s pan lozenge editions. Anybody who's familiar with the channel will have seen these shared before in pan lozenge videos. This is the pan lozenge, that little piece of livery artwork there, which screams modernity. And interestingly, you'll see it was inconsistent. It says pan science fiction there, but not there or there. And, you know, you get that there, you get different things there. So it wasn't consistent, but it was beautiful. So this let's talk about this cover. Apparently he hated this cover. People always bring it up. Yeah, he hated it. Fine. Okay, that's fair enough. I can understand that. I personally love it, even though Blood the Dog, from the story A Boy and His Dog, which is seminal, and you know, if you only ever read one story by Ellison, it should be that one. You know, it looks like a cat, but of course he's a mutant dog. He's telepathic. Yes, he's not described like that, but you know, this is SF. And there's Vic, the solo, who looks rather older than he is in the story. And there, you know, I just think of Halloween Jack from David Bowie's song Diamond Dogs, which really is sort of based on A Boy and His Dog, about the telepathy and a future New York post-apocalyptic, very, very much there. And this was the first Ellison collection I read. There's a video on the channel about it. I'm not going to talk about it too much because I talk about it at length in that video. It is in my top 2 favorite genre SF collections of all time. I cannot decide whether this is number 1 or Alfred Bester's Dark Side of the Earth is number 1. It's one of those two. Those are my 2 favorite ones. What's number 3? I don't know. We'll come to that in a future video. I can't say enough good about this. There are later editions where the text is tweaked. The American edition has different content, some more stories. I favor the British one. Obviously, I'm used to it. I've read and read and read it, and have been doing so for 40 years plus. And really, I don't think it gets any better than this. You know, it really is without fear. It really is without fear. The words fail me, really, quite honestly. It's just amazing. So if you can pick that up in that UK edition, the American stories, the American edition, which adds other stories, they're good stories, but to me, they feel out of place. It's probably because I'm used to it. And that, I think, is pristine and perfect. The other early read for me with Ellison was this, Deathbird Stories, which contains a number of sort of award winners. Absolutely beautiful. And it's subtitled A Pantheon of Modern Gods. And there were some earlier stories in this, some contemporary ones. And really what he did was he looked at the way that people worship different things. And it's got wonderful stories like The Whimper of Whipped Dogs, which is based on a true murder case from New York, which people watched but didn't intervene. Along the Scenic Route, which is kind of a Mad Max thing, which is fantastic. On the Downhill Side, which is a very sort of elegiac fantasy. Neon, which is really, really funny and irreverent. That's great. Pretty Maggie Money Eyes, which is about a woman whose consciousness ends up, when she dies, her consciousness ends up inside a slot machine in Vegas. Marvelous. Shattered Like a Glass Goblin, the great anti-drug post-Vietnam story. At the Mouse Circus is incredibly surrealistic. Pain Gods in here. Adrift Just Off the Islets of Langerhans, that was a big award winner, Hugo and Nebula. And The Deathbird itself, which is an experimental thing that comes from different angles. One of the best example of American New Wave. Really, really great stuff. And Deathbird Stories came out, I think, about 75. This was collected. Let's just take a look. Let's see. HARLAN Ellison 75, first published 77 Millington, the hardcover UK, I've got that. And this is the 78 pan edition. Really great. And there's this thing at the beginning, this little sort of preamble which says, you know, the reader is advised not to read all these stories at once because their emotional content is too great. And that's typical HARLAN hyperbole, but it really does punch you in the gut, it has to be said. Fantastic. So those two, for me, are probably the core of Ellison's finest work. If I were to pick out things to go for, it would be those. Approaching Oblivion, he hated the cover for this as well. He hated the old spaceship cover. I can understand it. I like it myself. It is what it is. And again, because he was bad-mouthing Pan about these covers, they dropped him because he was so rude, you know. And yeah, okay, fair enough. I understand the frustration. You imagine how Tom Dish must have felt when there's the edition of 334 from Panther with a spaceship on it. And it takes place in a sort of, you know, a social housing block in the near future, nothing to do with spaceships. So, but it was meant to sell the books, and you know, this has got some great stuff in it as well. Approaching Oblivion, good title. I got this secondhand. It cost me 30p a very long time ago. And, you know, one of the Catman, that's a good story. I'm Looking for Kadak is a great story in this. This planet where of aliens, and they've got these sort of like little wheels for legs. And they're all Jewish. It's really, really funny because Ellison was Jewish himself, and you know, he liked sort of going into Yiddish and, you know, and sort of being self-deprecating about it. Really, really good stuff. So that's a good one. Catman's an interesting kind of superhero type story, and yeah, not read it for a long time, and I must. But yeah, there's some really good stuff in there. Really good. That's worth picking up as well. They're all worth picking up. That's the fact of it. The two books on the left were early Ellison's for me, and I think this one, The Time of the Eye, was one of the very first ones I had, and my father bought it for me. It was, I can't think it was this one or this one, I think it was Time of the Eye. And my father used to have regular hospital appointments when I was young, right the way through until the 80s, and he would have to go down to Cardiff from where we lived and have a checkup every few months because he'd been very ill when I was very young, and it affected him all his life. And he would pick up a book for me, and he had really good taste. He bought me my first Alfred Bester, and purely, you know, on instinct, because he hadn't read any fiction since he was a teenager, and that got me going. That was Dark Side of the Earth. He just went by feel, and he might have looked at my bookcase and saw that I had Beast and Deathbird, but he bought me, I think, this one. And these two are kind of companion volumes. They sort of both issued about 1971. They had several printings in the 70s and 80s, and they're Granada, and yeah, great stuff. These are sort of great stories in these. Time of the Eye, lovely, look at that. And yeah, this is a book I've loved for a long time, and you get amazing stories. Are You Listening? Great story. Try a Dull Knife, In Lonely Lands. Oh, this is just deathless stuff. Time of the Eye is a shocker. Very Last Day of a Good Woman, fantastic story. You know, this is just such seminal stuff. You must pick these up and read them. I could go on at length about what they're about, but I want you to discover them for yourself. And really, really great. That's one of the great Ellison collections. As I say, they do overlap sometimes. All the Sons of Fear, that's another great one. The last time these were around was mid-80s, and that was about the only time I think I could actually sell any Ellison in a format. They sort of leached out of print then. And this has I Have No Mouth or I'm a Scream, The Discarded, which was made into a TV show. Was it Outer Limits? Sort of like final tranche of them, late 90s. Deep in the Darkness again is in this one. Repent, Harlequin. You know, these stories sort of get repeated, but these collections are all worth having, and you're better to have something like this than a collected or a complete, because you can work your way through them and you get more focus, I think, on a smaller number. Really, really nice. Those are great. So those are early ones for me. So I was really sort of expanding outward through his key period. So reading Deathbird and Approaching Oblivion and Beast That Shouted Love. I was rediscovering his stuff, and you know, they're great, great stories set on other planets, set on Earth. Very fierce and burning, and you know, those are the key things. And if you focus on the science fiction stories from, say, about 1959 to about 1973, you've really got it, you know. And this is an oddity. Phoenix Without Ashes by Edward Bryant and Harlan Ellison. And this is, I only picked up this A format quite recently. I've got the Savoy UK first of it, and this is from the tie-in to an abortive TV series called The Star Lost, which Ellison wrote, and then it was kind of botched by the producers, and it really is terrible. Generation Starship type thing, good story, and this is the novelization of the first episode with some sort of additional stuff. And it's really written by Edward Bryant. Ellison did the plotting, the characters, and it's not bad, you know, it's really good. And I was really pleased to get this Fawcett A format one, which is quite uncommon. And I have seen the pilot episode of The Star Lost, and it's pretty terrible. Doesn't sort of stick to all the stuff. And you know, Ellison was very much railing against the makers of films and TV shows he'd been involved with, and how they, you know, because he would write the shooting script and it would contain everything, and the director was just supposed to follow it, because directors have their own idea, they're in charge, blah blah blah, and often they don't know anything about science or SF, so you know, he used to fall out. But it's good to have that. It's well worth a read. The Savoy edition I do have somewhere. I was going to sell it because it's a large format thing, a very garish thing, but I've got really strong sentimental feelings for it, so I've decided to keep it. Though I don't know where I put it, but it's one of those books that, because it's in an odd trade format, there's never any right place for it. It's always a sore thumb, so I'm pleased to have that, though I'll probably never read that edition because I want to keep it spiffing. Good stuff. As the 80s wore on and the trade paperback started to become a thing, and Ellison was working with different publishers, we came to the end of the A format trail for him. And Partners in Wonder, as you can see here, this has got a remainder punch in it. See that hole there? Just put my finger there. So I didn't get this new. This is Partners in Wonder. I got this secondhand. As you see, it's got some fading down there and faded spine, bit of ripple. So I got this secondhand. I'm not sure when or where, but it was a long time ago. And basically this, again, is from that tranche. Let's have a look at the date, 83. So throughout 83, they were doing a couple of Ellisons a month in the spring and the summer. And this is all collaborations. So it's quite interesting. You see, we collaborated with other people. And again, you know, there's a commercial imperative at work here, because obviously they think, oh, you know, we get all these people involved, get my mates in, and we can make some money. And there's some interesting names in there in collaboration with Robert Bloch, Ben Bova, Argus Budris, Avram Davidson, Delaney, Joel Hensley, a more obscure figure, Keith Lormer, William Rotzler, who wrote, was it State of the Art? I can't think what it's called. Robert Sheckley, Silverberg, Slessor, Sturgeon, Van Vogt, and Roger Zeleny, and unassisted. So yes, there's great stuff in here. And yeah, brilliant. So all kind of things. Amazing. And the Bloch and Ellison, of course, is two stories, one by Bloch, one by Ellison, and they're about Jack the Ripper. So they're quite interesting. And Bloch, of course, wrote did he write Yours Truly, Jack the Ripper? I think he did. Of course, he wrote Psycho, which is the most famous one, lots of other great things. He wrote some SF. He went right the way back to the Lovecraft era. Yeah, and there's all sorts of things. I will admit, a lot of these I've only read once and I need to go back to. And some of these people, like Lormer, Budris, a lot of these people, it's the first time I'd ever read them. And of course, I've read them in collaboration. So in a way, Ellison introduced me to all these people. I don't think looking at this, when I bought this, it was a long, long time ago. I think apart from maybe Sheckley, Delaney, Silverberg, Zelazny, I hadn't read the other guys. So I guess maybe my view of them was coloured by this. So I need to reread that because it's been a long time. So that was the kind of thing which is a bit more of the huckster thing, where he would have these ideas that were saleable and commercial and marketable. And, you know, why not? You know, why not? If the writing's good, that's all that matters. Finally, from that tranche I picked up back then, and I think I picked this up on a later visit to Forever People in Bristol, was No Doors, No Windows. And yeah, again, 83, it is more spine faded, so maybe I can't recall. I can remember buying at least two tranches there, but it might have only been 2 or 3 books. And of course, one didn't do big book hauls then, because one was very young. I didn't have lots of cash, you know, I wasn't even working at that point. So I think, again, I got this later and based on the condition compared to the ones which I know I bought. I love that title, No Doors, No Windows. This is one of the few Ellison books I don't have in hardcover, though I do hope to remedy that. And this was a fairly new collection then, I think. Yeah, copyright 75, but he copyrighted all his stuff. But I think this is a paperback first. I think this was a new book then. And again, there's some stories which are in other things, Whimper of Whipped Dogs. That's about the only one that really pops up. And again, this is the period where you see Ellison writing more general fiction short stories, and you get that in Shatterday as well, which is a couple of years before this. And I like that period because he mixes the two up and he's saying, you know, no, I'm not going to be pigeonholed. I'm not just going to be an SF or a fantasy. I'm going to be a writer per se. And there's good impassioned stuff in there. And I haven't read that for a while, so I need to go back to that. So it's been ages. So there's lots of great stuff in the 80s. And another 80s book, Stalking the Nightmare. And this was the last book I bought by him new in an A format. And yes, got the yellow text block. There he is, doing the job, toddling along, little guy, the wee man, as Delano called him. Fantasia Press, which would be hardcover 82. Second Berkeley printing 85. And I almost certainly bought this from Forever People, or maybe from Forbidden Planet or Fantasy Centre in London. Stalking the Nightmare, forward by Stephen King. Who's he? And yeah, good stuff. So essays as well as stories. Let's have a little shifty. Wow. And again, I've not read this for a very, very long time. Yes, I've got to revisit that. And I do have a hardcover of that somewhere. So that's Ellison in A format. The A format was still very much alive at that period, both in the UK and the US. And the A format kept on happening in SF up until about 2000 and 2001. There's still the odd one now and again, but it was the key thing then. But Ellison, because he wasn't a genre writer in the same way, you couldn't convincingly keep marketing him as an SF writer, especially once you start saying, I'm not an SF writer, I'm broader than that, what have you. Mostly they ended up as trade paperbacks, you know, and the trade paperback, its cachet then was very much that the trade paperback was literary fiction. It was more intellectual, it was more beetle-browed and thoughtful, and that's the way it panned out. So that was kind of the end of Ellison in A format. I'll show you some more when I pick some old ones up. Hope you've enjoyed that. But I'd say if you haven't read him, you know, where do you start? Just get one of the collections that focuses on the material from, you know, the very end of the 50s through to the early 70s, or even just the 60s. So try and get Beast That Shouted, Love at the Heart of the World, or Deathbird Stories, I would say, or possibly a couple of these. And take your time, let it sink in. If you're a young reader who's used to big fat books, never mind that. Think about, you know, how much you enjoy a good sweet or a nice little sort of spiky, you know, drink. Think about, you know, something that's flavoursome and, you know, that doesn't sort of fill you up with stodge, but that satisfies you nonetheless. That's the way to think. So that's Ellison in A format. Hope you've enjoyed that. Would like to see your comments. I'm sure a lot of the older viewers here will have great memories of reading HARLAN stuff for the first time, and he really, really was very special. This is Outlaw Bookseller signing out for now. Bye.